Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the association between biological sex, gender, and the family. So just to break down some basic words, just to give you an overview so you can understand some of the terminology. So sex and gender have to be considered separately. Sex is based upon biological factors such as chromosomes, gonads, genitalia, hormone levels. Gender is a perception of which category you think you belong to. Now, there's some great questions, such as how many sexes are there? And in modern times, you have to say at least 3, male, female, and intersex. And then the variety of intersex, there are hundreds of different types of genetic diversities. Other people might use words like genetic mutations. But again, I want you to be thinking about whether or not intersex is a disorder. So I'm using a little bit of a different word there. But again, the combination of chromosomes, genitalia, gonads, hormone levels is very extensive. And so you could question whether there are actually over 100 different types of sexes, depending upon the combination, for example. But for any institutional review board, we need at least 3, male, female, and intersex. Gender as a category, again, is a social construct. This method of categorizing people based upon a set of attributes is a social construct. It is us who came up with the ideas of grouping people into male and female, and then now in modern times you see the extension of gender categories to be dozens and dozens of them. As society is more accepting of non-binary identification, of being able to branch out beyond the limitations or beyond the categories of male and female, gender categories are being constantly reconstructed daily. Like I, as a sociology professor, cannot even keep up because every 5 seconds there's a new gender. So the idea is, how many genders are there? It's infinite. It's as many as we want to socially construct. However, these gender categories, just like a culture, once you identify with that group, you learn the norms and expectations attached to that group, and therefore it starts to structure the way you think and the way you behave, and not only the actual physical brain, but also just your general cognitions and perceptions. So I like to think of gender as a perception of what category you think you belong to, and it has to be totally separated from sex. However, sex and gender, they are interrelated because there are biological influences that are attached to your perception of what category you think you are. Again, all thinking, cognition, it's all biology to begin with. So you have to ask questions like, are your genetics associated with your behavior? And again, this is definitely the realm of psychology because you're really getting into the brain. But you can't deny that there is some influence of biology upon social behavior, upon the way you think, okay? And so again, we're going to take a biopsychosocial approach to studying sex and gender because it's really the only way to understand, because all of these factors are interrelated. We'll get to that in a little bit of a later slide. Gender identity, in turn, is, so once you identify with a category and then learn the expectations and norms attached to that category, and you learn this through stimulus and response, through operant conditioning, through social learning, through observation. So there's several theories of learning about how we learn about gender. Those are the psychological theories. And then the sociological theory we'll talk about here, which is the socialization process. But again, everything is interrelated. So gender identity, once you learn the category that you think you belong to, then you begin to adopt, model, imitate the behavioral norms and expectations attached to that group. And so the identity itself then becomes imprinted in your brain because it's a stereotype through which you see the reality. Okay, so by having a stereotype, a prototype about gender, that then structures yourself. And again, this is pure psychological theory of the development of the self, but categories that we belong to then structure the way we think about ourselves. So think about it. When you go to describe yourself, how do you do it? I'm a professor, I'm a parent, I'm a husband, I'm a guitar player, a musician, And so does my belonging to the group of musician then structure my sense of self? And so gender identity can penetrate the inner workings of the mind, because gender itself is a category through which we see reality and make sense of reality, okay? So, the identity, the self, is a multifaceted construct. For example, does your race as a perception of looking through the world structure your identity? Now, there's no biological basis for race, but since we socially constructed that category, just like gender categories, once you belong to a race, then it then penetrates, the way you see the world, which then structures your behavior, etc. So this is a very extensive concept. When you start to delve into sex, gender identity, there's an infinite number of articles going on here. I mean, a lot of people are studying this. It's very pertinent in modern times. So if you guys are interested in this, please look into it. My PhD in psychology is in gender and sexual fluidity, and we'll talk about sexuality for the next chapter, so I'm not going to go into that right now. But you would also define sex, gender, sexual orientation as a separate category, but then how is your sexual orientation then associated with your gender, and how is sexual orientation and gender associated with your biological sex? And so again, this is a very dynamic, interrelated processes going on here. It's very deep. You have to delve into biology, the structure of the brain, and cognition and perception in the social world. Very, very in-depth stuff we're studying here. So again, we're just giving you a general overview because it's just a chapter study, but if you guys are interested in this, check it out. So gender expression, again, is that impression management, that, how we express our gender identity. Do we match our group norms? Are we counter to the group norms? How is that going? So again, and then gender expression is once you learned the expectations and norms of the group, right? So then to be put on that performance, pure dramaturgical analysis, like symbolic interactionism. By interacting with the group that you identify with, you all end up, kind of conforming to the ways of the group. Therefore, the females conform to one way of life, and males conform to one way of life, and transgender to a different way of life. And again, so the way we express our gender is influenced by the social constructs of how we create gender categories themselves and then attach attributes, expectations, and norms and behaviors to that. And so gender norms are the norms of the group. So again, we stratify in society into groups, basic social stratification, the division of labor, but also the division into social groups based upon other factors such as cultural differences. And so you got to ask, for each gender, is there a separate culture? So is there a male culture, a masculine culture, a feminine culture, a transgender culture, a heterocurious culture? And again, it's very extensive gender categories. Heterocurious is a new one. That one got me thinking. I hadn't heard heterocurious until a couple months ago. Again, I'm being socialized these words as I, interact with the literature and working at school and things along those lines. But still, there's new words I've never thought of. But, for each group, are there specific gender norms attached to those groups? And so you have to ask those questions. And then gender roles is the performance themselves of the norms and expectations attached to that group. So we perform gender roles, the duties, expectations, norms that we are socialized, that is that we all conform to, for example. So what are the roles of a parent? So once you become a parent, do you then take on the role of a parent? Or once you become a doctor, do you take on the role of a doctor? Or if you a teacher, do you take on the role of a teacher? And then when you go home, you put on your comfortable clothes and you're no longer in teacher mode. But when you're at work, are you in teacher mode? Are you playing out that role? So we all do this concept of doing gender, okay? And so the concept of doing gender is the concept of fulfilling the gender roles. And gender roles are simply defined as the expectations or the gender norms attached to gender groups, okay? And so once we learn about the gender groups, we then perform the role. Non-binary is defined as not identifying as male or female, identifying with a different gender. And then again, the binary term comes from this extension of genders from a 2 category to a 3 category with transgender to a infinite number of categories of gender. Like Facebook has like 69 different genders on there. It's just I cannot keep up. So transgender is simply defining as identifying with a gender, or you could say sex group, male or female, or masculine and feminine, that does not match your biological sex. So again, if you are biologically female based upon a measure of chromosomes, genitalia, hormones, and gonads, and then you identify with something that's different, that's the identification for transgender, but that's very extensive. So that means anyone who doesn't identify with the actual gender category attached to their specific biological sex is technically transgender. Intersex, again, and this is where I get very critical of, psychological diagnoses and biological diagnoses. I like to ask questions like, is intersex actually a disorder of sexual development? And that's how it's defined. It's defined as ambiguous chromosomes, genitalia, gonads, and hormones, okay? So you can't, a doctor can't specifically say which category you belong to based upon those measures. But, is intersex, it's 1 to 2% of all of humanity is intersex. So it's in our DNA, it's in our genes. So is that an evolutionary adaptation? I mean, what happens if a virus, all females are susceptible to a virus? Well, some intersex can reproduce. And so they could survive the virus and reproduce. So maybe that's just a way of our DNA building in backups so that our species doesn't get wiped out. So I like to question the diagnoses of intersex as a disorder. Just something to think about. And then sex assignment at birth. So when there is an intersex case, doctors historically have just engaged in sex assignment, sometimes without the consent of the parents. Now that's becoming a little bit of a taboo, and it's getting a lot of media publicity. And so we're really questioning this sex assignment. But when you guys look into things like sex assignment, you find that there's somebody who was born as a boy, but they did an assignment as female, and they felt like a boy the whole time. They never understood, and then all of a sudden they found out why. And there's tons of cases like that. So there's a lot of stuff here that you guys, if you're interested in, please delve into it and study it. And then how is this associated with the family? Again, it really breaks down into this concept of family dynamics, development, and the roles that we take on, the expectations, fulfilling the norms of social expectations for the families and who's supposed to do what job, and then the whole purpose of the family and how we raise our children, how we socialize our children. And much of that begins in the family, which we're about to talk about. So theories of gender. So again, from a functionalist perspective, what's the purpose of gender? How does it structure society? And, why do we divide into gender roles, into masculine and feminine roles? And you could go way back thousands of years and start arguing things like, well, maybe the men were off hunting and the women were staying home, even though we pretty much disprove that. And again, women, just because they're pregnant, aren't helpless, because they can also rely on other women. And so you see a lot of that built into your biology, the concept of being female and the group interaction a little bit more so than the male. Why is that? Does that have to do with pregnancy? And so how does that, associated with the family? But why do, people divide into roles in the first place is a really good question. So again, is it because men are off hunting and women have to stay home and take care of the kids? But there is a lot of logic to it because a man can't feed the children. So there are these times that if someone had to go off hunting and someone had to stay home, I always say that women's rights are really dependent on things like freezers and formula. Because without a freezer and a formula, a man can't actually stay home and take care of the baby. If we needed to go out and get food, you would need a female to be able to stay home because I can't feed the children without, a freezer for breast milk or a formula. And so that's a really important thing to start thinking about, is how women's rights are actually very fragile, and they're based upon a stable society where we have some technology to make it so a woman can go to work after having a baby and the baby can still eat. So again, this initial division of labor into masculine and feminine roles, this traditional ideology, the construction of traditional ideologies, the ways of, family dynamics of a female being the homemaker and a male being a breadwinner or a provider, is a lot based in biology. There's some functional roles there attached. So you could say the purpose of dividing into gender roles was so that all the needs of society and the family could be taken care of. Conflict theory would say things, well, the division into gender roles resulted in males having more dominance and economic power, and it resulted in the subjugation of females into the home where they were then subjugated and dependent upon males. And in modern times, like in the U.S., women have gained rights and now have the ability to get a job and things along those lines. But recognize, guys, the ability to leave the home is also based upon technology. So there's a lot of stuff here. There's a lot of conflict because while women are pushing for their rights, it's also dependent upon a very stable society. So American idea of women's rights might not hold up in a country where they don't have electricity like we do, and they don't have access to formula, and it might not hold up for somebody who's poor and can't afford the $50 bottle of formula. So there's a lot here to start thinking about. But general gender inequality results from the prejudice and discrimination attached to gender categories and the subjugation of females into a minority group where they had less life chances over their life. And then symbolic interactionism, you can look at it like gender roles are socially constructed. We're the ones who created family structures in a society that is divided by gender, and that the jobs and the roles are, divergent, and that we expect different things from females, and there's different norms for males and females. But again, we're the ones who came up with this concept of gender, and we're the ones who socialize people to fall into these gender categories. And then feminism is just an extension of conflict theory, which really is just pushing toward equity and equality for all. It's not like some liberal wing. It's just all feminism states is like equality is awesome, and that's it. So again, the striving for equality or equity between the genders is the basic premise of feminism. So the book opens up talking about, is there a preference for male or female babies? And it talks about, some of the policies in China and things along those lines. But, generally, naturally, the world is about half male and half female. And so the Chinese policies, for example, resulted in a lot less females in China, like 40 million less females than males, which then increased sexual violence against women, and it was just, all kinds of problems. Now they're having declining birth rates. Now they're encouraging women to have 2 and 3 babies. Again, but that prejudicial, attitude of like Henry VIII, like killing his wives because they weren't having boys. Again, that goes into the whole structure of patriarchy and how that structures the family and society in general. But again, gender bias originates from prejudice and discrimination attached to gender groups. You find gender bias in families, you find gender bias in society, you see gender bias in the workplace. Sexism still exists despite the passage of civil rights. Violence against women is insane. It's like 1 in 3. It's just crazy. It used to be 1 in 4. And then Corona happened and it went up even more. 1 in 3. So again, based upon Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality, again, these systems of privilege, power, and oppression seek to reduce the life chances, access, opportunities of women and other minorities. And, again, that phrase that women are the most oppressed, the women, the oppressed majority, really holds weight because there's more women on the planet than men by, a small percentage, but still they have less power over their lives. Women, females globally, again, you get into the structure of patriarchy and male dominance and the subjugation of women. They tend to have less rights globally. You're definitely seeing a lot of that backlash, like in Afghanistan right now. And then based upon your ideology of your culture, that is also associated with structures of power. And again, the saying is women are more likely to be property than own property in the world. So again, as a sociologist, there's a lot of activism here. Okay. So gender socialization occurs through agents of socialization. The family, peers, education system, media, society, agents of socialization from the womb on. are structuring your behavior, structuring the way you think by structuring the groups that you belong to, and then teaching you the roles and expectations, the culture of that group. So from the womb, once your parents found out you were, what sex you were, the first thing they started doing was putting up colors, you know what I mean? Doing your room a certain way, buying specific gendered toys, okay? So you guys have been structured to think and behave in a certain way from birth. And again, this is a totally unconscious process. You don't consciously learn about gender until your consciousness really develops, but that is much later in life. And so by, 3, 4, 5, you definitely have a solidified sense of your gender identity based upon the sex that you are. Okay? And so, kids at 3 know what sex they are. And then they start looking to the people into that sex to figure out how they're supposed to behave. And then society has been socializing you to act and behave in gendered appropriate ways. But again, what is gendered appropriate is socially constructed by the dominant culture. So whatever group in power is establishing the dominant culture, that then becomes the norms, ideologies, values, belief systems, cognitions, knowledge, way of thinking that you learn. Again, do boys know how to put on makeup, and why not? Do girls know how to fix an engine, and why not? Are girls being structured into English and boys into math and science, So you have this range of gender, and I'm really critical of the thinking of gender as like a linear continuum between masculine and feminine. I like to look at gender as just multiply axes like galaxies in the universe, because that's kind of what it is more like to me. But again, this range between masculine and feminine, or not identifying with this masculine and feminine gender, some other gender, then influences toy choices, the activities you do, your specialties, what kind of job you choose, the groups you interact with, who your best friends are, the culture you belong to. Okay? So whether or not you guys know it, all of you guys have been socialized into a gendered culture by agents of socialization. Contained in that culture is an entire way of life. So when you ask, is there a difference between black culture and white culture, where did that come about? Segregation. Is there a difference between masculine and feminine culture, and how did that come about? Segregation. Okay? So because we have these stratified groups, stratified cultures in society, depending upon the sex that you are and the gender you identify with and the groups you decide you belong to and the groups you're socialized that you belong to, it then influences everything you do. It influences the bathrooms that you choose, the way you talk, the way you dress. Huge concepts here, guys. So gender role socialization, again, huge topic, could never cover it all in one lecture, but look into some of this. Because again, how do we learn about gender? It's the biological factors. The brain is seeking out stimuli and then coding that information. It's the psychological factors, cognitions, the way you observe and then imitate and model the behavior. It's the social factors, how you're socialized and then socially controlled. Because what happens if you deviate from the gender norms? Do you get called out for that? Do we stigmatize people in society that don't match gender norms? And the answer is yes. So gender roles in the family. Again, you had these traditional ideologies of women as homemakers, men as breadwinners, compared to the modern times like in the United States where we have egalitarian attitudes like whoever wants to do whatever is totally fine. If the guys want to go and cook and clean and take care of the kids, whatever. If the girls want to go out and be doctors and lawyers, no problem. That's egalitarian. But guys, egalitarian attitudes do not exist globally. Most of the world is very traditional. And traditional ideologies toward, gender roles is associated with a reduction in women's rights. Because again, gender structures your behavior. And when you step outside of that gendered behavior, like in societies where they don't appreciate women going to college, they will check you. Okay? So are gender roles associated with biology? Guys, your biology is not, your brain is nothing but neurons releasing neurotransmitters. I mean, it's just chemical processes. Your brain interprets chemicals, and that's how it makes sense of reality. So, of course, biology is involved. Plus, you have all these inner motivations. You have unconscious processes. You have hormones being released, which are attached to your sexual orientation and then what you're attracted to. And of course, these are all playing a part. And then the biology of the family itself, of nurturing and taking care of your kids. And, there is a huge process here. And some people, when I do surveys on this, like, do you think a woman is better at raising kids? Most people think a woman's better at raising kids. And most people think that, like, and that's just, that's just something I want you to think about, because I'm thinking about it right now. Like, why do people think girls are better? Because guys also have biological reactions when we have kids. Okay? A male is very aggressive in general compared to a female. However, what happens when a male has a baby? Their testosterone goes down. They become more sweet and nice and kind. And that happens with age too. So again, males have also nurturing built in. So, how is your biological sex associated with caring for the children and things along those lines? A lot of that's engraved in there, guys. These are just basic biological processes of reproduction and sex drives and mating rituals. And this is totally kind of beyond this topic, but again, when we start studying things like relationship types, like, it's in your biology to be with one person, to be with many people, but you get more brain rewards by being with one person. So why does a male and a female come together to blend their genes, things like that? That's all part of our biology. But we don't just go male and female. Like, it's also in your biology to have same-sex relations, okay? So, when we talk about sexuality, we'll ask questions like, does everyone have gay genes? And the answer is yes. Otherwise, people wouldn't do it. So how has gender roles changed over time? Again, this is the many waves of feminist movement, from the suffragists and gaining rights to vote and demanding, equity and pay and the ability to get jobs and become doctors and lawyers, to the modern movements of no sexual violence. Please pay us the same amount. And so you have a lot of that going on right now. We have challenged traditional gender roles, challenged traditional family dynamics. When I first had my child, there were no males in the car line. Now the car line is about a third, almost half of males. Just raising my kids, I'm seeing the changes, okay? But again, women are getting a lot more college degrees. Males are staying home. Women are becoming breadwinners. Men are staying home with their PlayStations and taking care of the kids. What up? So what modern pressures have influenced the family structure and dynamics? Again, though, think about how this has changed the family. So since the 40s and 50s and beyond, as technology has increased and more women have left the home for the workplace, who is taking care of the kids? How has that changed the family roles? What if now in modern times we have so many two-parent working households? How does that affect the kids? How do they have to pay more for daycare? Is daycare on the rise? So who's cooking and cleaning now? And then guys can get into things like second shift, where even though women are going into the workplace in modern times, they're still doing most of the housework and things like that. And so the concept of second shift is something you should also look into. So again, who does what in modern times is a really good question. But this is not a global question. Globally, men and women are just doing the same thing they always have. But in America, we've challenged what does it even mean to be male or female? How many genders are there? How many sexes are there? Family dynamics are going in all kinds of directions. The nuclear family has totally become a minority. There's more single-parent households. Women are getting pregnant before they're getting married because they don't even need a guy, and it doesn't matter, and it's not a social taboo like it used to be. You used to be kicked out of the society if you had a baby out of wedlock, but in modern times, that's totally different. 4 out of 10 girls do. So again, the biopsychosocial perspective, we're introducing this as a way to understand, family, because, how much of our being a family and creating families and taking care of our families is biology. How much of it's psychology, the cognition processes and the brain functioning, and how much of it's sociology, the influence of the social context, the socialization process, the culture that's already been in play for generations, So a lot of things you guys got to be thinking about. But as I'm saying, this is a very deep subject. It's not, I mean, like it's my PhD's in. I mean, I've been studying it for years, and the more I study it, the less I know, because I start delving into genetics and biology, and before you know it, I am totally lost in all this information. Like, I had to go study DNA, what are chromosomes, and I had no idea what any of this stuff was until I opened a book and started studying. Gender identity, again, is when your sex and gender do not match. Oh, sorry. Let me say that differently. Transgender gender identity is when your sex and gender do not match. A general masculine or feminine gender identity, again, is based upon your biological sex and what you were socialized into. And so it's just in modern times, your gender identity used to be exclusively whatever your sex was. And so now gender identity has gone beyond that to include gender, transgender. And then now gender's gone on to include all these different genders. And so gender identity itself has become this flux of so many potential identities that we could categorize in a billion different ways. But this is why the idea of fluidity is becoming more popular, is that gender identity is fluid. You know, we go back and forth between masculine and feminine and androgynous in the workplace and all these other ways. And so it's not as clear as it used to be. So it used to be sex and gender match, that was everybody. And now sex and gender does not match, and that's kind of becoming everybody, because we're just deviating beyond traditional gender roles. We're incorporating things like I always say this in my classes, but like males need to incorporate female culture, a feminine way of life, if only for our brain growth purposes. Because by suppressing our emotions and not crying, we're actually reducing our ability of our brain to grow. So again, this adopting of multiple gender identities, or just a gigantic, all-encompassing gender identity, or whatever, is a new modern trend, but it's opening up the door to new expression, new ways of thinking and behaving. Like, can I, as a male, talk about my feelings with my friends? And that sounds silly, but again, are males socialized to not talk about your feelings and bottle it all up and then just violently, aggressively explode? Would males talking about their feelings reduce violence in relationships? All kinds of questions here. So again, gender identity, another huge concept, tons of stuff going on there. But again, you got to ask, is your gender identity associated with biological processes? Because guys, your sexual orientation is totally biological processes. Think about attraction and scent and all of that process. Those are all just your brain firing neurons and your body's endocrine system releasing hormones. And yes, your endocrine system and your nervous system are totally associated with behavior and cognition, but the categories themselves are socially constructed. So we make sense of reality based upon the socially constructed categories of gender. So then our biology interacts with these categories to then structure our brain in the way you think. So again, the nature-nurture process is incredibly extensive when it comes to gender identity. It is associated with your biology. Some people say it's like John Locke's blank slate, where you're born with a blank slate and all gender is socialized, but that's like totally denying the role of biology. And I'm not a biologically deterministic person where I say biology is like the number one reason, but again, your biology, you feel and experience, and then think about it consciously a little bit. Because again, most of things are unconscious, guys. You haven't been conscious through this whole lecture. Consciousness, I trick my psychology classes and ask questions like, if you're awake, are you conscious? The answer is no. You're not conscious the entire time you're awake. Most of you is unconscious processes. So your brain has been doing all of this stuff. Your body has been doing all this stuff and interpreting information and coding it all for you. So yeah, it's nature versus nurture. There's a huge blend there. So how has home, education, and work change as a result of a shift from traditionally gender roles to egalitarian gender roles and the increase in women's rights in society. Labor historically was stratified, segregated into roles. Women did these roles, men did these roles. Women were not allowed to go to school, not allowed to become doctors, but they could become teachers and nurses, that kind of thing. Males weren't supposed to be nurses until now, that kind of stuff. Okay, so again, who does what? Who does what role? Are women allowed in Congress? Are we going to have a female president? You're starting to see all this stuff in play. At home, again, the family dynamics have totally changed about who's doing what role, who's doing the childcare, who's doing the cooking, who's doing the cleaning, what the expectations are. Now it's like people just need to kind of talk amongst themselves and work that out. So again, prejudice and discrimination historically existed against females. We are fighting this and combating it, but it still exists. Women are still paid 20 cents less. Women are still doing more of the homework, Women are, but now, despite women being denied access to education, now it's flipped. So women are getting more educations than men. And so I read an article the other day that was talking about this, and it was saying, well, what's going to happen when you have a super educated females and a bunch of uneducated males? What's going to happen to the males? Is crime going to go up? Drug use going to go up? Just things to think about. And so, but you see this radical shift, or are the guys just going to become homemakers and women all of a sudden are going to take over the world? I don't know what's going to happen, but that article got me thinking, and then, so how is women going and taking over the world going to, change things even more? Because that's what's happening. Because education plus job plus wealth equals power, right? So if women are getting more education, and then if they can find a way to overcome the discrimination in the workforce and then get the jobs, and then they can take over the world, very interesting to see what might happen. Again, thank you all so much, and have a wonderful day.